Okay, well, I think in the interest of time, let us get started. So, hello everyone. Thank you very much for joining us today for the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance Assembly on scaling cities climate finance in the context of COVID-19. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Barbara Buchner and I lead an advisory analytical organization called Climate Policy Initiative, which works with governments, businesses, and financial institutions to drive economic growth while addressing climate change. CPI, my organization, we act as the secretariat of the Cities Climate Finance Leadership Alliance, a mouthful, so we will call it Alliance from now on. And the Alliance is a multi-level and multi-stakeholder coalition aimed at closing the investment gap for urban and subnational climate projects and infrastructure. The Alliance endeavors to become the main platform to convene and exchange knowledge among all actors dedicated to urban development, climate action, and financing. And amongst its members, the Alliance counts both supply-side organizations, such as public and private financial institutions, several of them here with us today, but at the same time also demand-side being represented by a number of city networks, and I'm very happy to see many of them as well today on our meeting. Just a little bit of the context before we get started. The pandemic clearly is a wake-up call that our cities must be better prepared for the climate crisis. As with COVID-19, the negative effects of climate change will lead to catastrophic consequences for cities. However, climate impacts will stay with us over a much longer period of time with even more devastating impacts. So today we will discuss how cities can rebuild a resilient low-carbon economy in the context of the COVID-19 recovery, and the strategy and the actions that are following the economic and social relief to address the fallout from the pandemic should sharply alter the approach to dealing with climate change. And cities and subnational authorities must be at the forefront of this recovery planning, and you really see them playing a really key role in helping us do that. So to address this topic, we have a terrific panel, lots of friends and colleagues here with us today. Today's session will include a keynote speech, followed by a panel with stakeholders representing perspectives of the city, of the national government, of private financial institutions, and public financial institutions. And just before we get started, a few housekeeping items. As you can see, again, we have an excellent lineup of speakers, and while our agenda is quite packed, we do encourage you to share your thoughts on this topic and questions for the speakers with us through the chat function. And I'll do my best to get through those during the discussion, but also to integrate them into the key takeaways that we will publish after today's event. We hope for this to be an open discussion, and we have saved some time for audience Q&A after the panel, so please feel free to type in your questions throughout the whole event into the chat box. For information, this session is being live streamed on the Alliance's website, and the recording will be available afterwards. And finally, we do encourage you to share the event and bring further attention to this important conversation using hashtag Alliance Assembly 2020. But with that, and now let's jump into the substance, and there is no one better to get us started than Michael Lee Bryce. Michael is chairman and CEO of Lee Bryce Associates, through which he provides advisory services and speaks on clean energy and transportation, smart infrastructure, technology, climate finance, and sustainable development, all extremely important topics and certainly extremely important in the context of cities. He's also the founder and senior contributor to Bloomberg New Energy Finance and a member of the UK Department of the International Trade's Capital Investment Advisory Board, and a visiting professor at Imperial College's Energy Futures Lab. And he also recently joined Sustainable Development Capital LLP as a senior advisor. And last but certainly not least important, he's been a real mentor to me and a real thought partner over the last more than a decade. So Michael, the floor is yours. Over to you. Unmute.
Yes. There we go. So yeah, thank you very, very much, Barbara. And you call me a mentor, but I call you a mentor. So I don't know how that works. We're mutual, but we've worked together a lot, and it's been a great pleasure. So 10 minutes. There's a lot to cover in an introduction, and there's a lot going on clearly with COVID. So let's take as a starting point, though, why cities exist. What is it about cities? And they are they are ferociously efficient places to do business. And I don't just mean the business of business, I mean the business of life, the business of human interactions. So we all, I suspect we're all experts on here. So we know the implications in terms of the climate, that actually cities are efficient. The average city dweller has a lower carbon footprint than the average non-city dweller by a factor of, I don't know what the academic work now says, but 30% or so. So we've got to maintain that efficiency of human interaction and of business and of planetary footprint. But we also have to understand that cities have 70% of the world's emissions now relate to, in some way, to cities, either direct energy consumption or the supply chains of food and of resources that cities consume. And cities have also always had a huge environmental cost, and it's just been accepted in the past. It's been accepted that cities have terrible air quality. Any historian looking at whether it was London or whether it was the growth of cities in the US, but even if you go back in time to almost to prehistoric, but to ancient history, the city has always been synonymous with dirt and with pollution and so on. So that is the kind of starting point that we are starting from. The idea would be, how can we keep some of the good things, and how do we address some of the weaknesses? And I think that certainly progress before COVID, enormous progress, very heartening progress was being made. So on the one hand, we had the greening of the power system, which was progressing very rapidly. And it's very easy for the Greta Thunbergs of the world to say, you grown-ups, we are doing nothing. But actually, there has been enormous progress. And you only have to look at the sort of deep penetration of renewables that's growing around the world. You look at the slowing of the growth in emissions from the energy system, which was flat in 2019, flat in 2014, flat in 2015, flat in 2016, largely, to know that there's a lot going on the energy side, and that energy is what powers the cities. And transport has started to green as well. Frankly, I'm surprised at how slow it went in cities. I don't understand even a few years ago why mayors didn't start to say that home deliveries must be done using zero carbon vehicles by, let's call it 2025, 2023, whatever. That seems an obvious way to harness for cities the trends that are out there. There's still a huge amount to do in industry. And of course, for a lot of Europeans, industry is something that happens outside the city because it's been relegated to places where you can sort of pollute the air, or where there's access to other, easier access to infrastructure. But in many parts of the world, industry still happens in cities and it pollutes cities. So more needs to be done on that. But I think that we were seeing progress and engagement, and it's credit to the work of a lot of people on this call or maybe watching, and others. Now the question is, what does COVID do, and how does COVID change that? Clearly, we're seeing behavior change in the short term, which will have stickiness in various ways in the long term. The nature of the city is going to change. Working from home, home medicine, home education, the fact that we all know how to use Zoom is going to cut down on the number of events that are held in cities, the number of times we have to commute into meetings and so on. So that is going to change. The COVID is also, I believe, accelerating this kind of trend against accepting the cost of city life. We've seen good air quality, and a lot of people want to maintain that. We've seen more active travel, and a lot of people want to maintain that. And so I think there are some benefits. It may be hard during a pandemic to really hang on to them and to tout them and so on, but we will see some sticky benefits in the cities. But we've also seen some negatives. The economics of public transportation are going to take an enormous hit, because as long as we have social distancing, the capacity of public transportation is dramatically reduced, maybe by as much as 85%. If you want to be socially distanced on a bus, you can't have the same number of passengers. We're talking in London, single deckers, 8 people, double deckers, I think 20 people. Dramatic reductions in capacity. And we've got to resolve that. We've got to lean into that. There's a lot of work being done on that, but there are solutions, restoring trust, integrating multimodal travel, active travel. So there's some things that can be done, but there is a very real risk that public transport economics become less attractive, less feasible because of constraints on capacity. Until such time, not only as there's a vaccine, but also as people's trust in public transport is restored, which might well be quite a few years. So I think and meanwhile, there's a big pressure to go back to private cars. And so we've got to make sure that things like road pricing and curbside pricing plans are accelerated. It's very nice to talk about cycling. We're going into the summer and cycling is a great way to do it, but we have to realize cycling is a piece of a solution, and walking over long distances is a piece of a solution. And how do we get more systemic solutions that still that don't end us back in the sort of 1980s and 1990s style gridlock that people will be familiar with? Coming to finance, one of the, I don't know, no, it's not a good thing about, I hesitate to use the words good thing and COVID in the same sentence, but we are going to be in a decade of cheap money. There's a lot of focus right now on the fact that we're in a period of low fossil fuel costs, so low oil prices, low gas prices, but we're also in a period of low capital costs. And that is likely to continue. We're probably going to see a couple of years of fiscal and monetary looseness, and then probably fiscal tightening and austerity, because that's going to be just inevitable. But the monetary looseness is going to continue. There's going to be lots of money to invest in upfront energy efficiency, clean energy, and transportation. But cities have relatively small powers. The hard power of a mayor to buy clean energy or to invest money in transportation is relatively limited relative to the buying power of all of the people and all of the organizations in the city. So there's a certain amount that could be done with green munis, and maybe they could be green bonds to fund city activities. You could purchase directly clean energy, or you could mandate clean vehicles. But I think the really interesting thing is to get into is, how can cities use soft power? How can they act as aggregators? Because these solutions are not massive power stations in the, outside the city. Some of these are distributed solutions, whether it's sustainable drainage, or whether it is energy efficiency upgrades, or whether it is extracting whatever renewable energy we can within the city bounds. And the question, I think, the really interesting area is, what can a city do to aggregate demand, and maybe to provide some guarantees or some credit enhancement, working with other players to provide large amounts of demand that is then financeable. And then the final point I want to make is that cities also have a lot of power vis-a-vis national governments, more than many individual players. Mayors, municipalities have a direct political mandate in many cases, which national governments are scared of. That should be used to the city's advantage. We should be looking at solutions that are devolving to the city, because the city very often knows how to solve its climate and pollution issues better than national government. And I like ideas like pathfinder cities, where cities don't just try and each get their little bit of money, but a small number of cities compete perhaps, but then try to go deeply clean, and resources are given to the ones that succeed. Because we need to understand zero carbon cities, deeply clean cities, not how to reduce the input, the footprint by 5 or 7% for all cities, but we really need in the next decade to understand how we get on a path to net zero. And with that, I'll hand the microphone back to Barbara.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Michael. I think it's very, very inspiring as always. I think both by helping us to understand really the role of cities and the immediate needs that we have in, as you say, keeping the good things but addressing the bad things. But I think really the need for systemic solutions. How can we make sure that really cities use the powers that they have, but that we also provide them the right tools and the right access to finance, that they can really address some of the bad things, as you said. So thanks so much for that. I'm sure we'll come back to several of the elements that you have raised in the conversations here. But with that, I think what I am going to do now is, and I see that all my panelists are on now, which is wonderful. So I'd love to introduce the great panel that we have, and that is going to certainly go deeper into the elements that you have mentioned here and that you have laid out, Michael. So let me introduce the panel, and let me do that in a alphabetic way today. So let me start with Marie-Amy Burry, who is the head of impact-based finance at Société Générale Corporate and Investment Banking. Wonderful to have you here. I'm very happy to have Chris Hurst, Director General of the Projects Directorate at the European Investment Bank. We have Mayor Mariam Idris, who is the mayor of Sagnarigo municipality in Ghana, but we have had some issues, connectivity issues. So we are trying, I think, to get her back on, and certainly important to get the perspective from a city mayor, as Mike have just laid out as well. I'm very happy to have Joachim Levy, who is the former managing director of the Brazilian Development Bank and the former World Bank Group Chief Financial Officer with us today. Hi, Joachim. And very happy to also have Julia Prescott, the co-founder and Chief Strategy Officer of Meridian Infrastructure. Again, I think some of the financial solutions, Michael, that you've mentioned, I hope to hear more about them from Julia as well. And then last but certainly not least, my dear friend Kirsten Sach is the longest affiliation as always, Director General of the International and European Policy, Climate Policy in the Federal Ministry for Environment, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety in Germany, and also the main funder of, together with BMZ, of the Alliance, so the assembly that we are having today. So Kirsten, wonderful to have you here, and we've already heard a lot about the importance of national government, so looking forward to hearing your mixed remarks as well. But let me see whether we have Mayor Idrisso back on, and whether we are able to connect to her. Okay, I think we're still struggling. That means that I'm going directly to Karsten. And again, just coming back to what I just already mentioned very briefly, I think everyone acknowledges the key important role that national governments play in combating the dual crisis of COVID and climate change. And Germany has played an important role over the last decades, really important leadership role. Can you just share with us a little bit how you see cities fitting into your strategy, so going forward and addressing this dual crisis here? And welcome again to this event here.
Thank you, Barbara. It's very good to be with all of you, and very happy that we were at the forefront of founding that excellent group here, CCFLA. And what to say after Michael, cities do the business of life, of real action. I couldn't agree more, Michael. What a wonderful line. And what we are about is fighting two crises at the same time, which are probably at a different time scale. So COVID and the climate crisis. And we see, starting from cities, that cities and local governments are at the front line of addressing COVID. We see that cities are hit harder than rural areas. And we see that high pollution levels are probably related with higher infection risks. And therefore, we see huge impacts. And Michael was mentioned some of them. We see that once public life starts again, we might have substantially not only more pedestrians and cyclists, but more cars, because public transport is seen as dangerous. So cities also suffer because they're the center of social life from lockdown measures. And so But on the other hand, if we talk about investments, it's about 64% are done at the local and regional level. So therefore, it is easy to say that investing in cities, in local governments, is very well suited for green recovery programs, because we can relate climate investments with high co-benefits for health, job creation, and overall well-being. And therefore, it's clear that cities need to be part of the solution. And if you look at our most recent recovery program, we have a stimulus package of 130 billion euros, huge money. And so if you see the headlines and the overall sections, I think we as the environment ministry were pretty successful. So there's not scrappage premiums on cars, which would just induce buying old combustion vehicles. So we avoided that. We are promoting renewable energies, which is good. We're promoting investment in cities, which is good. The headlines are all good. But are we at the stage which Michael put forward as well, that we have a blueprint for real deep transformation into cities which really go climate neutral in the time span we're doing? Probably not, because we have an optimization factor that we should deliver quick results now. And quick results and being very imaginative, there is a certain conflict in that. We think that we try to just focus on switching towards sustainable electric transport solutions, new bicycle pathways, expanding capacity of public transport, and a renovation wave for buildings which create direct jobs and direct benefits. So cities needs funds. So what I'm doing with my national climate initiative, which is probably the main source of transformative investment in our cities, at least the incubator. So normally, as we normally do, is we give them 60%, wherever the rest of the money needs to be put up by the cities, as they are in dire need of finance. So we reduce their own contributions in time to get money out of the door. Second issue, they are dire in need of just getting the knowledge transferred. So we are just trying to setting up incubators. And I think there is an element of what Michael was proposing, that you create champions of deep transformation while highlighting economic growth, direct recovery, and social well-being. And therefore, I think we have pockets for that, but it's not the mainstream yet. But in closing, cities are key. Cities are in direct contact with the people, and therefore we are trying to working with you and within our country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carsten, and thank you so much. I think what you really highlighted is the big dilemma that I think many governments are in now, but not only governments. I think everyone trying to react to the crisis. So this problem, delivering quick results, but being innovative and really making sure that in a way in this recovery, there is a way to really accelerate a transition that I deeply believe we are already experiences. And again, I think also Michael said in the beginning, all the good things that are already happening even pre-COVID. But again, I do think we need this deep transformation. So I very much like the 2 points that you had, like helping cities to have better access to funds by reducing cities' own contributions, but also thinking about these incubators and thinking about how can you come up with the innovative solutions, the systemic solutions that really create these champions of deep transformation. And then hopefully also through the Alliance, we can help share the knowledge and make sure that others have access to this knowledge. So thank you so much for this. I think we are still having issues with the mayor getting on. And also let me maybe move on and hear a little bit, the role of the private finance in this context. Again, certainly we all know that, the governments are key at the moment, and we know in the climate finance world, certainly the public finance has been the engine behind overinvestments, but we also know that we are falling far short of what is needed, and we need really private finance to come in. So Julia, let me turn to you and hear a little bit from you how you think that the financial sector can really step up, making sure that investment capital doesn't flow into or creating, sustaining assets that really are likely to be stranded in the near future. And really trying to understand from your side a little bit what are the barriers that you feel for private sector engagement in financing sustainable infrastructure, specifically in cities, and whether COVID will increase these barriers, or whether you see that there is an opportunity really to come up with new solutions. So Julia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Barbara, and good afternoon, everybody. I just want to address the issues about stranded assets, which are very much things that investors aren't very keen about. I mean, they've come more to the fore in relation to climate change. I mean, initially in relation to the energy sector. I mean, who now invests and where's the value in coal-fired power stations, for example? Or in relation to cities, concerns about low-lying cities by themselves as being potentially stranded assets. And another area is energy efficiency in city buildings, where there aren't really clean energy levels that are acceptable. Buildings are going to lose their value. They're going to be less easy to rent. And so it's very straightforward to say one of the things that investors really want to try and avoid are these stranded assets. And they need to have, investors, when they're looking forward, a certain surety over time that they're going to be expecting the value of investments to be retained. So when we look at it, we think, how could this be achieved? And really, how does this outcome align with the need for cities to ensure that they can attract this new investment? I just want to respond to Barbara's point about the issue on what are the primary barriers, because I think one of the issues, and I think we've already heard a little bit about it already, even though there's a lot of money coming in through the financial system, big liquidity lines in governments, these are going to banks, a lot of them are going to employment support. But there was a lot of liquidity out there from institutional investors, and they are still looking very closely at where they can invest in infrastructure. I mean, infrastructure is being seen as one of the really solid long-term lines of investment. And then on the other hand, you've got cities looking in the other direction for the investment that they need. They have urbanization, climate change, but there's a gap in between those wanting a type of investment and the city's ability to provide it, particularly after the COVID crisis and the wish to build back better and greener. I mean, I think I'd summarize the barriers and the nature of the gap between the money out there, of which there's quite a lot, the need, of which there's a great deal. And really, when we look at it, we see there's often a lack of viable funding models. There's limited expertise. We've already talked about that. There's a lack of replicable projects. There's capacity, project preparation, pipeline planning. There's often high development costs. And there's a difficulty on focusing on the development of long-term resilient infrastructure when city needs are immediate. And I think we've heard about that already as well. COVID-19 has exacerbated these issues. There's hugely added uncertainty for investors. And particularly when I look at transport, there's a whole area, we've talked about the cost of public transport already, how the economics aren't working, but how will this move through over time? You know, we're at 2 meters at the moment, for example, in the UK, other places are at 1 meter. How is this going to work through? And how do we know what is going to happen? So we're also at a very uncertain point in relation to the type of investment. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about a little bit today is how we at Meridiam, who recognize the need for investment, want to make it, and actually how we see that we can work together with cities to actually deliver that type of investment. And maybe we can pull some ideas from that. Recently, we have launched a newly designed urban resilience fund platform called TURF. And that's together with our co-creator and anchor investor Rockefeller Foundation, together with the port of the UNCDF, to address these issues. TURF will initially look at cities in the MEA, looking at everything from mobility to transition, built environment, smart city, circular economy, and resource management. And the aim of this is to have two vehicles, one catalytic capital, which will provide a tool to enable cities to unlock delivery. And then secondly, to have a blended finance actual investment fund, so that will mean that it actually, with equity, quasi-equity, and a concessional element as a pure blended finance tranche, will actually enable lower cost funding to go into that public and private capacity, and bring public and private together to support the deployment of urban projects. And I think that having these dual platform approach, the first actually helping cities in early stage project preparation, structuring projects, is really going to be something that is going to push that pipeline forward. And then once the pipeline has been pushed forward, we can work with cities to actually use the investment fund to put together a financing proposition. And I think that this is a solution that private finance can really use, not just the one, not just putting money in, but actually covering the gap between wish to put money in and need, and then following that through with financing behind it. But nothing is certain. I think COVID-19 has shown the speed at which it's happened, the need to which the needs that have arisen as a result of it. And the only way that we can actually do that is also as part of this fund is we have a series of embedded resilience objectives, and we're working through a resilience committee. So we're always checking back again to make sure that we're sustainable or resilient, that the project ideas that we're coming forward can actually be delivered and produce ESG benefits and mitigate those climate impacts. But I just wanted to give you first of all, good news that there's a lot of money that does want to go into city investment. I also wanted to say that what we've tried to do at Meridiam is to come up with a very practical approach towards actually delivering money for cities going forwards.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julia, for sharing that. And I think that's certainly some of the good news there is that are very much needed. And I think couldn't agree more with you that having this dual approach where you really address some of the issues of having the pipeline, but then really making sure that you in a way help build the capacity as well and address multiple of the barriers that you have highlighted, and is the way to go. So really coming up with specific pipeline and then having an investment fund that can really go and put money into the projects that you are helping to develop, I think is very, very valuable. And I'd love to get also others' thoughts on that. Okay, I think we just had the mayor on, but now I think we lost her again. We will get to that. Again, it's like some additional challenges we're dealing with here. But let me now turn on and continue to hear more from the private finance side to Marie-Aimée. It's wonderful to have you here. And again, I think what I've already said, I think we know we're falling far short of where we need to be. I think Julia just has kind of shared one of the concrete solutions that we could have in order to address several of the barriers that we've heard from other speakers already. Love to hear from you a little bit more. What are some of the innovative financial approaches that you think can help cities progress towards a green recovery, and also, again, just maybe sharing some of the role that a bank like Société Générale has in increasing their deployment.
Sure, thank you very much. And maybe to start, I'll give a brief description of what is our impact-based finance team, because I think it's also our practical way, as Julia explained in Meridiam site, to take a step to address the gap. And so, in fact, that team is a small research and development team that sits in the investment banking division with the objective to act as a catalyst to engage our business lines into new markets and new solutions that directly contribute to the SDGs. And our vision is that if we want to bridge the 2.6 trillion annual funding gap for the SDGs, and of course, which includes the climate, the fight against climate change, we absolutely need a disruptive approach. We're not going to make it just with incremental innovation and green bonds and the likes. And we need that approach to be applicable also, and in particular in emerging markets, where most of the funding gap is and where most of the city dwellers will be by 2050. And so speaking about disruption, when you asked me to speak about, what is the impact of the COVID crisis, I think one of the major learning from this crisis is a positive learning that in a situation of a disruption, it revealed how agile and how creative and collaborative people have been. Citizens have been really very good, as one of the previous speakers mentioned it, to find solutions with limited resources, and the faster to react were the citizens and the corporates, not so much the public sectors in many ways. So that's very interesting, and maybe we can think about how we can continue to use the same disruption to relaunch the economy and try to continue to have this mindset of achieving more with less. So of course, we need to disrupt the way we are financing, and initiatives like the one mentioned by Meridiam, I think is excellent, and I'll come back to that. But our views, and that's really the core of this impact-based finance approach we have, is that before we think about financing and credit enhancement, etc., we must first see what we can do to collaborate with the municipalities and the public sector to better conceive the public planning and better coordinate the solutions. So away from a siloed approach and with more collaboration to try to solve multiple problems with one investment, and think about what additional impact we can deliver with the same piece of infrastructure, because this is a type of approach that will increase the bankability of the project, increase also its resilience, its acceptability by the citizens, and overall will make it more bankable, so easier for us to then structure financing on. So that's why, staying in this idea of a disruption, I think what we need is disruption with a shared vision, so a collective and coordinated disruption. And so some examples could be that, for example, we could advise and help municipalities disrupt the way they issue their RFPs, and think about it in terms of impact and not in terms of infrastructure needs. So that we can let the private sector innovate and propose cross-sectoral solutions. So, for example, a concrete example that we came across recently from a large, city agglomeration looking to spend 5 billion euros to renovate high schools. Well, instead of issuing an RFP on renovation of high schools, we can express the RFP in terms of impacts you want to achieve, and not only in terms of access to education, but also what are the other needs from the community around the high school, including the small industry, as was mentioned earlier, the jobs that are created and the service providers that could contribute to this project. And also what could be the private use of the premises while the students are not in, and what additional revenues and learning opportunities it could bring to the students. How can it be used to bring back biodiversity in the area? So really a multi-impact, holistic approach we think is key. And on the other side, on the solution provider side, have the same mindset of not only proposing a technical solution, but seeing how it can be augmented to provide more impacts, more services, potentially more revenues. And if it can be it cannot be provided by that certain company, maybe partner with other companies. And then to come back on the idea of disruption on the financial solutions, I completely agree with Julia that the key is really to propose both solutions for project preparation and then funding, because there's no shortage of funding of long-term investors who want to have access to high impact, resilient assets. So I think where we should disrupt ourselves on the financing side is first on simplification and standardization, because a lot of those investments, they are small size energy efficiency, renovation, all these type of things which are not, $100 million bulk, and that the investment banks are not very good at tackling. So how can we simplify and standardize our, credit process and legal documentation using digitalization, using digital platforms to track impact and payment track record, so that we can quickly create aggregation vehicles and then replicate that. And then the second disruption, I think, will be in credit enhancement, because there is even more now than ever, with all the trillions that have been spent for the crisis, really a need that every dollar of public money is there to leverage private money. So it should be systematically bringing private sector into any form of public financing. And in this sense, the example given by Julia is a very good one, to have a blended finance fund linked to a project preparation facility.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mariam. I think that was certainly, main point. We need disruption, and I think couldn't agree more. I think I very much like you're thinking about how can you really go away from a siloed approach with more collaboration to address the various barriers that we've already heard from Michael and onwards, all the speakers. So I think get specific examples, both in doing it on the financial side, but also before you go to the financial, really, what is procurement, what's the role there, how can you come up with more innovative ideas, and where can you really innovate in order to have a more systematic approach. I think very much appreciate that, and I would love to hear also others' thoughts on that. But let me see again, I know we have Maya coming in, and we have had her on a few times. Let me just see for a second whether she manages to dial in or speak up. Or have we lost her again? I think we unfortunately might have lost her again. Then let me, with that, then go to one of the public financial institutions, one of the very important ones. And again, I think we already have heard that we need obviously the private sector, but we do need a better use of public finance. And I think we'll have an excellent speaker here who can share views about the role of multilateral financial institutions, and particularly coming with a perspective of their European Union. So Chris, be great to have you here. Again, I think what we see is that multilateral banks are also in the work we've done over the last decade, they play a critical role in bridging public and private finance to maximize the benefit to countries. Again, since we have started at CPI tracking financial flows, our work has really shown that development finance institutions more generally are at the heart of climate finance. So I'd love to get your thoughts on really what's the specific roles of these banks, particularly of EIB on the climate green recovery, and how can these banks make funds more available to municipalities, but also what you see as some of the challenges there. So Chris, over to you.
Well, hello everybody, good afternoon. Well, good afternoon European time at least. I know it's morning for some of you, but thank you for the invitation to attend in this meeting. For those of you who don't know the EIB, I hope many of you do, is the EU institution, EU bank, owned by the member states of the EU. And though most of our business is concentrated in Europe, in fact, we are active in 160 countries around the world. Climate has been a key part of our activity for decades, normally recently between a quarter and 30% of what we do. But our president, when he was presenting Lucy in the UN General Assembly last year at the summit, set our new targets for the coming decade that we should reach 50% of our lending being for climate and environment by 2025. And that over the next decade, we would support €1 trillion of investment in that area. Cities are key to meet our targets, and typically in the past, we've been lending about 20 billion a year to all sorts of investments in cities, covering water, transport, buildings, and all sorts of investments. Now, Cities are, of course, critical for both mitigation and adaptation to climate change. And I think it's good for us just to remind ourselves of the degree of the challenge. Today, half of the world's population live in cities. By 2050, 2/3 of the population will be in cities. And in that process, we are adding 6 billion 6 billion square meters of new building every year, which is more or less the size of adding New York City every month to the building stock. Now, what is really the biggest issue is that 2/3 of that is built without any kind of standards of any kind whatsoever. So there's enormous legacy we're building up of inefficient cities and inefficient buildings. And as the world gets hotter, there's going to be large demands for cooling. In fact, as forecasts say by 2050 that the 20% of electricity demand will be required for air conditioning to create livable conditions. And in fact, the World Health Organization has estimated that 250,000 people a year will die in 2050 because of extreme heat. So now, while that is not quite the same level that we're seeing this year for COVID, this is a crisis that will continue year after year after year after year. And so if we don't do something, we are in the same realm as the kind of misery that COVID has created more recently. So municipalities are crucial in that. One of the elements that multilateral banks can help to bring is sharing of knowledge, of course, through platforms such as the one we're talking on today, but sharing knowledge. And I would like to underline that that's not a north-south issue at all. And it's perfectly normal that city managers in a given city don't know all of the possibilities that there could be in front of them. And we in the IB, for instance, have been involved with supporting investment in Paris, looking at ways to increase the energy performance of schools in Paris, in Milan, and in many European cities. So it's quite normal that we should find ways of exchanging information, sharing information between ourselves. The multinational development banks, I think, play a particular role because they sit between, on the one hand, government, who are also our shareholders, the cities, at the same time, the private sector, and of course, people who are bringing grant to available to help the process. And one reaction which I've seen on the chat line, but I would also react to is, whilst it's true that interest rates are very, very low and likely to remain very low, it doesn't mean to say that the public sector borrowing capacity is very high. And in fact, on the contrary, we may emerge from the COVID crisis with really a massive increase in public indebtedness, both at the national and subnational level, leading to really a possibility of difficulty for people to borrow on their own account. So we have to look at new ways of funding things, new ways of taxation, new ways of gaining the benefit of increasing land values that occur due to the investments that are made by the public sector. And I think also the MDBs can bring a particular role in order to see how we can structure those things to bridge the gap between the limited borrowing capacity of the public sector and the investors that indeed has been mentioned are looking for places to put their money. So I think we have that role of sitting between these different players. We have a role in de-risking investment, because if we are present, then private investors can have a little bit of assurance, perhaps, about the relationships that we have, and regulatory risks will be reduced. So I think that can also help the process. And finally, I think we have a role in helping the public sector to best use the monies that they want to give, the technical assistance monies that they want to give, to allow to really identify examples, and we can do that in a variety of ways. I mean, one thing was worth mentioning is the Global Cities Challenge, where cities are competing to get funding in order to develop projects, which of course will be pilots that can be used to give inspiration to other people. So we also, EIB, we're involved in many initiatives, such as the GAP Fund, and I'd like to thank the German government for their support to that. It's been and of course the Luxembourg government too. And we're hoping that was agreed in the EIB board in May, and so we're hoping that we will be able to launch that in September. So in a nutshell, we have a huge challenge to do, and something that we really have to work together on. And I think EIB, like other multilateral development banks, is just one of the jigsaws that is an important part of the jigsaw, however. Thank you.
Right. Thanks so much, Chris. And I certainly agree. A very important part of the jigsaw. I think the roles that you have outlined, both being kind of, the one who sits between different private sector, the cities, helping also to enable, to basically help create some of the policy enabling environments, also by having this close understanding of your member states, plus having their role in deep de-risking and in highlighting best practice. I think really important. The GAP Fund, I'm very happy you're mentioning that. I do hope we will hear a little bit more about that later, as it again addresses one of the barriers that both Julia and Maria-Amy have highlighted, really the need for doing more on the project preparation side. So the GAP Fund certainly another very important element there. But as we're continuing to struggle to get the mayor on, I think we have in the meantime also asked for just making sure that we get her remarks if there are issues. I think let me then with that just move on and turn to Joachim Levy, who I'm very happy to have you here with us today with the expertise that you bring, both from being a finance minister, but also obviously at the leadership of both Bandesa, but also at the World Bank Group. I think I'd like to get to you with a little broader question, just understanding a little bit, the role, of the potential kind of debt crisis that we're seeing as we see outflows from emerging markets happening at the fastest pace ever, and this potential debt crisis looming in many of these countries. So cities clearly are in a situation that they both need to cut spending, but also spend more on both the recovery and the long-term resiliency. So I would love to get a little bit your advice on what you would give to those dealing with these issues and how they could react to those.
Hello. Well, every city is unique, and of course, communications, digitalization, they're giving a new breath of life to small, medium-sized cities. But large cities remain central in many countries, often reflecting the identity of the whole nation. And these are more complex situations. Now, specific needs and opportunities are different across cities, but most cities suffer from a narrow tax base and depend on transfers from provincial national entities. These constraints very often limits the ability of cities to borrow and give the stimulus to adopting these innovative arrangements that with the private sector often that were mentioned by some speakers just a few minutes ago. Now, COVID-19 brings a new dimension to this discussion because while cities, of course, you face new budgetary challenges and so on, especially in developing countries, they are the place where fiscal stimulus can have a large and immediate effect. So cities, national governments, and development financial institutions, the DFIs, need to recognize that fact and act upon it as soon as possible. We know that city public work can mobilize a large number of unskilled workers, ensuring income to households, and at the same time building infrastructures that yield long-lasting benefits to communities. So prioritizing labor-intensive, replicable projects that don't put an undue pressure on a country balance of payment when its exports are struggling is a good start. Also to minimize possible future mismatches between projects' revenues and debt services. I think that investment in sanitation is a good example, associating these labor-intensive civil workers with the need of careful choices regarding capital expenses. So a design relying on sustainable energy sources, but perhaps having a slightly higher capital cost at the beginning can reduce the risk brought by, for instance, shifts in fuel costs, which is a major consideration in many developing countries. And with these, actually can mitigate financial pressures and the risk of service degradation in the future. Sewage treatment technologies that minimize the need of chemicals and also can generate biogas to run a plant also would have merit. I believe this approach can be applied to transportation systems where, as was mentioned, you can consider the possibilities of electrification and the impact on cities' pollution without the long construction periods and the costs often associated to rail solutions. And an area that's a little bit beyond that, but the digitalization of services that can free public workers to other activities. Of course, there is no panacea, but the focus on flexibility and sustainability can be very helpful when resources are scarce. And it was noted at the beginning, technologies can drastically change working patterns, mobility, and even people's lifestyle. Now, DFIs can help establishing principles and best practices, streamlining the budgeting and financing of programs, and also giving more transparency to it. But I believe that cities, national and regional, global, even initiatives, association groups will be ever more crucial in helping guide the national governments in designing fiscal stimulus. Not the least because the FDIs are more and more client-driven, and so it will help finance projects that are based on the demands of borrowers. Now, since, as was mentioned, the natural interlocutors of the DFIs are national governments, who are the ones who guarantees the loans anyway, it is very important that cities get the ear of their national governments. And for this purpose, common views among cities around the globe can lend credibility to cities' demands to national governments concerning the selection of sectors, actions, options of technology, like I mentioned, that you bring maximum benefit to people and also ensure the sustainability of these investments and increase the resilience of cities. So I think this approach would also help DFIs mobilize private finance domestically and globally if there is some common view, because this will increase investors' trust in the option finance. So again, this is the worst of times, but it's also the best of times. And I think that by developing common views, working together, say, in this kind of associations of cities, can be extremely helpful to mobilize finance to find a true sustainable solutions with this view of resilience and also to net zero emissions over a period of time. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joachim. Very, very helpful remarks. I think particularly thinking about really how you can make sure, you know, this leadership of cities and really making sure that cities get the ear of the national governments, and how can you make sure what are some of the concrete proposals there. And I'm very happy to see Mayor Idrisu now here as we are just hearing again more and more how important this leadership from cities is. And I would be delighted to hand over to you if the technology allows us now, and just, you know, give us a little bit of your thoughts on you know, the challenges that obviously you have been facing through this pandemic, but also at the same time what you mean that what you think that the COVID-19 and the economic response mean for climate action in cities, and what more can be done by other actors to really help cities that are looking to promote a green economic recovery. So Mayor, the floor is yours. If we unmute you, you need to unmute yourself. Let's see my team. We cannot yet hear you. Okay. I think, as you've heard from several speakers, technology is extremely important. We need to
Hello.
Oh yes, here you are. Wonderful, Mayor. Please, the floor is yours. We can hear you.
Hello.
We can hear you.
I think it's the network again. Hello.
Okay. That was very close. Mayor,
I
could
don't
hear you.
know whether I'm on or off. I think I can continue. I was saying that we have 11,964 confirmed cases in Ghana, 4,258 recoveries, and unfortunately 54 deaths. But currently the government of Ghana has put up so many recovery programs and has also instituted several measures to control the spread of the disease in Ghana. As we speak,
Okay. Unfortunately, I think we are going to try to get the mayor back again. Just see for a second here. Yeah, I think, and unfortunately, we're continuing to have this technical issues with having the mayor online, and we will make sure that if we can't get her back, that we at least get her remarks and making sure that we share what she wanted to contribute to this discussion here. So let me maybe just, as we're still gathering questions and trying to make sure that we are getting the questions from the audience to the speakers, I just had a few actually initial ones that I wanted to actually post back to some of our speakers here as we're then waiting for another round of interactions. But maybe let me just ask actually Michael, as we still have you on. Had one questions from Felicity from Climate Kick, asking about many cities are cautious about increasing the debt burden to the expected impending recessions at this time. So I just trying to get your views on whether whether cities should be cautious about increasing debt burdens due to the expected impending recessions. And then in the chat we could see also Jerry Muscat from EIB, who emphasizing that cities can use their planning and other soft power, plus the key need for cities to prioritize very carefully the pilot initiatives and leveraging the grant resources that they have access to. So again, it's just around basic this risk of increasing debt. So Michael, if you have any thoughts from your side.
Yeah, so I as I tried to lay out in my initial thoughts, at the moment, I said that there's going to be very cheap money. That doesn't mean that it's cheap from the city. I think what we're going to see is from national treasuries, both fiscal and monetary loosening, and that's going to be for the next couple of years. I think realistically, we've got to anticipate that after a few years, hopefully COVID will have receded into the background, and almost inevitably, we're going to be in a period of, in the UK, it's been dubbed austerity and it's been labeled as intentional and evil and so on. But the fact is that we can't keep spending at these levels forever without currencies being debauched. And so therefore, we're going to see this period where, although the interest rates are likely to stay very, very low, but we're likely, and there may be quantitative easing for quite some time, but the taxation base won't be there to keep just spending money in the same way. But that for the cities, I think that it's absolutely true. Their budgets are going to remain under enormous pressure because it's very clear that these excess pressures on public transportation of limited capacity are going to fall on city coffers unless they can pass that on, as has happened in London and other cities, to the national level. But some of that pain is going to be shared by the city. And I think that social care costs are going to fall on cities. And one of the time bombs that we don't yet know how big it will be is that the health impacts of COVID-19, even from those who have recovered, there may be a very high burden of ongoing health issues, whether those are physical health around the lung scarring, but also they could be around psychological, mental health. This has been a very, very difficult period in many ways, everything from domestic violence through to isolation and relationships breaking up. So, and those costs inevitably, I think, fall on in many cases cities. So the cities are going to be under huge pressure. And maybe I wasn't clear enough in my call, therefore, for the sort of soft power of the city is to act as an aggregator, maybe as almost as an investment banker to arrange guarantees, but to aggregate. And I think many of the participants have talked about some of the mechanisms in much more detail than me. But I think that is inevitably where this needs to end up, because cities don't, until such time as the city state can issue its own currency. You know, we have the Brixton pound, but there's not a lot of liquidity there. So as long as that is not the case, then cities have to use that soft power, the power of aggregation, the power of arranging, the power of advocacy vis-a-vis national governments, the power of getting its institutions in the room. The city is also the location in many cases of the financial institutions, whether there's, you know, the institutions on this call or others. And I think there's a convening role of cities. And I think it's in those directions that we're going to find the most interesting tools and the most rapid progress, with the support, which I had missed, which is very critical, of the multilateral finance players who can act as a sort of second conduit from the national governments to the city level, which is where so much of this actually has to happen.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Mike. Actually, let me just, before I'm going back to Carsten, I'd like to go to Chris, to you again, just also because we do hear a lot about the power, the soft power. You know, how can we use that more? How can MDBs basically help also kind of serve as the second conduit that Michael just said? I'd love to just hear a little bit from you what your thoughts on this are, but also kind of maybe linking it a little bit to you know, what's the, you know, to the current EU situation, the EU Green Deal, where there obviously is a lot of action also happening. And I think one of the first real examples of how you can link green recovery to some real climate ambition here. So love to get just thoughts from you on this point, but also combining it a little bit on what is the role basically on what is the EIB doing to support cities to use their soft powers. And I know there's a lot going on.
Well, it's quite interesting if you have a look at the graph of GDP and carbon emissions over the last 50 years. Every time there's a crisis, you see a little dip in the CO2 emissions, but then immediately after the crisis, this rebounds back and continues on a steady upward growth path. Now, this time around, it's been a little bit different. We've had a 20% drop in April of emissions compared to the average for 2019. So there's been a mega change in behavior. A large part of the order of half due to changing transportation patterns, but another half as well due to reduced economic activity of one form of another. So the question we have this time is, how can we ensure that this rebound is a green recovery, and we don't continue what has happened in the past and just going back to the bad old ways. Now there are a number of key elements that are a win-win for both for economic growth, for recovery, and for the climate. I mean, building renovation is one, and public transport, which will need investment, is another one. Developing the circular economy, of which cities have a key role to play, is another one. Developing green alternatives to manage, for adaptation, to manage flooding and the like in cities is another area. And we have to rethink public spaces and transportation in general. And what we have to do, which we try to do in the IB, is try to make sure that urban planning is taking into account the co-benefits of reacting to COVID, and at the same time taking into account the climate benefits. So, I mean, we have to develop criteria for at the sector level initiative in order to sector level projects city level projects to assess which ones are actually going to meet these dual criteria. As we said before, the role of technical assistance in developing these examples, pilot projects that we can use to spread knowledge and ideas is critical. And we've already mentioned the Gap Fund, which is an important role, and there are others as well, such as Felicity, which we do with our partners in GIZ. So there's a number of activities where we have to work together to use the sparse funds that are available to come up with really the models that can be used to inspire cities to move on this path. But the bottom line is that we need to have extremely good forward-looking planning that takes into account these various constraints and tries to come up with solutions that ensure a green recovery at the same time as taking into account the changed behavior that we have because of COVID.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Chris. And certainly the importance of really good planning, I think, and how, again, MDBs can help cities do that, I think is extremely important. But let me come to Karsten. I think, Karsten, we have, obviously, there seems to be a major shift in funding priorities, with funding going towards this economic recovery in the wake of COVID. But how can we ensure both that funding doesn't lock in emissions-intensive industries, but goes towards green infrastructure, but then also relating to one of the questions that we have from Amidou Guindo on more generally, what are strategies for resilience and adaptation that cities can employ, and how can cities work to increase organization, the enabling environments? Again, what is the role there of also of national governments?
Thank you, Barbara, for this question, and it's good to speak after Chris. Thanks a lot for the excellent cooperation in the Gap Fund. I come back to that one. Just want to give two answers, one more for the German and the European level, and the other one for the international level. At the German and European levels, you see that we have a much more enlightened debate this time than we had in 2008, 2009. And I think most of all the headings and headlines we're having under the European Green Deal or our recovery package are fine. And there are two big elements. The one is have a big portion into green infrastructure financing, and I think that's in. And Chris mentioned the examples from buildings through new kind of public transport infrastructure and also digital infrastructure. That's pretty good. But anyhow, there's the other one, that's to operationalize the do no harm principle. And we in Europe are in the midst of setting up something which we call taxonomy. So developing criteria both for the public but also for the private sector of what green investment really means. And we can see that we are all still grappling in getting the details right, and while speed is of essence, and having good examples and training people to understanding the limits and the consequences of what mitigation and building more resilience means is still a key. And I've just subscribed to all what Chris has said, but it's and we just need to work in building project pipelines for green recovery, and then forward-looking planning, technical expertise is important, but also, and some of you mentioned it earlier on, out of recovery, we cannot design a real transformation if there is not a reform element. So that means getting prices right, so getting the framework rights, getting the way how we attract private finance right in times of low interest rates. Probably in cities, there are many people who are looking for good investment opportunities. On the other hand, you have a dire need for investment. So there is a lot of possibility for creativity at the local levels, which form solidarity within cities as well. And I think we are just tipping the top of the iceberg. The second one, yes, we are relatively privileged in Europe and in Germany, and we're trying to setting up with the World Bank, with the EIB, through the Gap Fund and the whole initiatives we are all working in of helping cities in throughout the world. And I think the GAP Fund, which is supporting early stage project preparation activities for low carbon development, is at the center, but and therefore we are very happy working with that. We in Luxembourg are the big grantees and hope to attracting others in it. But that is of course only worthwhile if the connection to the project preparation facilities further downstreams and the C40's finance facility Felicity, the city's development initiative for Asia and others that we link up very well in that and that we can really mobilize investment into green infrastructure and just coping with the finance gap there. And therefore, it is important to have these funding mechanisms combined inter alia with the leadership for urban climate investment, or LUCI in short, so which is the more political framework. And we were very proud and happy that LUCI and CCFLA are now just closely interlinked, thanks to you, Barbara. And therefore, we are hoping that we can just put forward really convincing solutions, both by being the incubator to some financing, but also having creative design thinking together. And I think I'm just that happy working with all of you on that one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karsten. And I mean, we are really happy and lucky again, first about again Germany's leadership, but then also really of kind of this more comprehensive approach that you bring, really trying to see how can we bring creativity to address the multiple areas that where we need some progress, from planning to kind of pipelines to kind of knowledge exchange. I think we certainly stand committed and ready to help making sure that you know, we do whatever we can to help the replication, the scaling of the good practices here. But then let me go to Mary Amy and just actually turn to one of the questions that we received in our chat here, which is it's often repeated that there is finance available, but where's the pipeline? And we've already talked about some of the ways to fostering a pipeline, but just from your perspective, what do you see as some of the best current initiatives investing in the city teams needed to bring forward this complex systemic projects that needed? So you have noted the capacity gap, the pressure to instead deliver quick wins. So just trying to understand a little bit what is, you know, two questions: what's the best initiatives on pipeline, and how do we fill the capacity gaps best?
Sure, and obviously it's not the core role of a bank, you know, to advise municipalities. Not only because, you know, we are not urban experts and you know, we only can cover such parts, but it's interesting that as part of our internal startup call, and that's, you know, the information I was giving in answer to that question in the chat, our real estate promoter, that is a subsidiary of the bank, its innovation head decided to create a startup called La Ville Plus, precisely to occupy that gap, that capacity gap, to help municipalities, but also you know, corporates, but mostly, of course, municipalities, co-create this quite complex system that needs to be organized within the city between the different solutions that are thought, and that needs to be inclusive and human-centric. And so where, again, I think it's interesting to see how disruption can bring results, is that they've decided to really do it with two focus, to be impact-based, so really bring everybody around the table and focusing them on, you know, what are the positive impacts they want to achieve, keeping in mind the constraints they have of not increasing negative impact or even reducing negative impact, and playing together with Lego bricks, so on serious games with different stakeholders, so that everybody can put themselves in the shoes of the other participants, so the municipality, the local businesses, the NGOs, the citizens. So that's one example where you can fastly break the silos, and on a quite paced basis, come more concretely to a consensus with a modelization of the impact. And there you can go back to the more normal process with, urban consultants, etc., that will put that into an RFP. But it will have been conceived with all the stakeholders in a short period of time and focused on impacts. And another example I wanted to give, because I really am a true believer in collective intelligence, and that's why I think what you're doing at the Alliance is so important. It's really to have some forums where different people can, put their thinking caps together and exchange, and in particular between private and public sector, because often, and I think it's the case in France and in many other countries, procurement rules are so strict that it's impossible to brainstorm, between public and private, parties before an RFP. And so then, the RFP comes out and it's completely blind of everything that it could have, used, all the collective intelligence that is out there. So a good example that we're also a participant to, and that I want to, to underline here, is the a collective initiative called Rêve de Seine Urbaine, which is a group of about 100 different companies, so private companies, but also NGOs, associations, etc., that is working on a territory which is north of Paris, an agglomeration of municipalities called Plaine Commune. It's about 450,000 people, and they have established a kind of sandbox experience where the municipality says, okay, I'm looking for ideas on this, like, for example, increasing clean mobility. And then the group there is an idea box, and the group can propose some ideas, and they put together some sole consortia, and the municipality gives a space in the city. Well, on that street, you can experiment this idea. And if it works and if it suits them, then they go for the formal RFP. But at least there is this sandbox experience, opportunity to exchange and interact without being under the scope of strict procurement rules. And I think this is a great place to maybe a great experience to maybe replicate and share this experience with other cities.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Maria-Mie, for sharing. I have Michael who wants to come in. I did want to then turn to Joachim as well before getting to the end. But Maria-Mie, thanks so much for sharing again these examples. And again, it's been fantastic having you also in the Alliance and really bringing this experience also to what we try to really help basically leverage and enable this knowledge exchange between private and public, and what is needed to make it more effective. So it's been great to have you there. But Michael?
Yeah, Barbara, thank you very much for letting me in. I wanted to come in on that point, actually, that Maria-Mie has just made, because I've seen this on both sides, both as a board member of Transport for London and as the more innovative startup or innovative finance provider. It's one of the really big barriers to innovation. And I think, we need innovation. I call it massive distributed innovation here. We need innovation right across the board, every industry, every sector, every geography, every fractal piece of this. And one of the things that makes it hard to innovate is the procurement rules, which are, of course, there for a good reason. The OJU rules in the EU and everywhere, the need for appropriate competition and transparency in procurement. The problem comes when the best ideas very often come from private players or outsiders, and yet if they go through the brain ache and invest the time to take an idea to a city, to take an idea to a government department, to take an idea to a municipality, they have to do all the education work, all the modeling, all the planning, all of the project pipeline development. And then the counterparty says, do you know what? I finally get it. I'm going to put that out to tender. And we've got to find ways of allowing those innovative ideas to come forward, and the idea generator, maybe not guaranteed to get every stream of income in perpetuity from that idea, a bit like a patent. You need to be able to make some money for some period from your intellectual property. And I would love to see more innovation like the project that Marie-Aimée just described. I think we need these sorts of systemic changes to increase. It's almost like turning up the temperature on innovation. I'm convinced good things will happen, but if we've got to get the innovation out of, maybe a better analogy is get the innovation out of the glue, because I can tell you, I've been on both sides, it's gluey.
Let's turn up the temperature and let's get more glue. I like that, Mike. No, I think you're fully right. I think, and again, I think it's fantastic just from this discussion here, like all the ideas that come out from this discussion. So I can already see lots of follow-up here, but I think we really need to kind of switch gears on how we think about that. And I think, as Carsten said before, this is only the tip of the iceberg. So I think we need much more that's really needed here. But let me, before closing, just very briefly come back to Joachim. And just like get a little bit more thoughts from you on one of the questions that we had around really how can cities work to increase organization in enabling environments, particularly again to make sure that there are strategies for resilience and adaptation that cities can employ. Just maybe some of your thoughts and kind of also summarizing, I think, some of the key points that you already brought before, but really to access cash, cities need to be organized. So what can they do?
Well, we have just a couple of minutes, so I'd focus on two things that I believe COVID brought forward. One is really a divide. It has to do with acceleration of technologies and of some structural changes that the pandemic has brought and will be fully felt in the next period. And I think this will change quite a lot the role of cities and may also increase the cleavage between, say, cities in developed countries, where all these technology benefits may take place very quickly. As was commented at the beginning, due to change transportation, it changed the demand for services, and then the way business is conducted in many of the developing country cities. And this will also have an implication between the big cities and smaller cities. So perhaps, and this is something for reflection, the most efficient way to use some of these technological changes would be to see how you can increase the attractiveness and effectiveness of smaller cities. Because we all know that in developing countries, the legacy, the problems of the big cities are so big that sometimes look almost intractable. But as in so many cases, technologies can disrupt the things and change completely path. So it may be that something that 15 years ago was not possible. Now, we're not talking only about physical communications, roads and so on, but also the data communication and what that implies to business activities and the role of cities, how you can rethink this for developing countries. And I think here, we have the EIB here, I think this could be a very interesting thing for DFIs to think together with their other leaderships. And also because going to these smaller cities, these disruption innovations that Michael was mentioning, probably will be easier than in a megalopolis, in a poor country, in a moment of huge financial and fiscal stress. So I think that could be a way to be agile and to use the COVID to really bring something new to the dynamics of these countries and their cities.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Joachim, for very much bringing this to a wonderful end of a really rich discussion here. I'm trying to look at all my notes and trying to come up with some of my key elements here that I have heard from all of you, and also from the very rich discussion in the chat. And I want to thank everyone who has been here with us, and we will share also the chat with you afterwards. But maybe just a few words of summarizing. I think certainly what we hear, I think cities are at the core, both being affected by COVID, but also a real opportunity in the recovery phase for cities to being at the core of achieving these dual issues of economic recovery, but also increasing climate action. And I think what we've heard here today is really that there is this issue, this problem, and delivering quick results and being innovative, but we need to think about how can we keep and replicate the good things and address bad things. I think that for me, the key takeaway is we need massive disruptive innovation. I think this is what for me is the key takeaway from this discussion today. I think we need a disruptive approach. We won't make it with incremental approaches here. We need to turn up the temperature or put on more glue, as Michael said it, but we need to do it on a range of different components. We need it both before the financing. We need to get away from a siloed approach. We need to have more collaboration to solve the multiple problems and barriers that we've heard. But we also, so we need innovative ideas like, on the procurement processes, but also systemic changes like the ones that Michael mentioned. But also we need a really disruptive innovation from the solution provider side, such as technologies, as Joachim just said. But we also need it on the financing side as a key to propose solutions both for project preparation and for funding. I think we've heard a few examples today, like TURF, like the GAP Fund, but also other examples that we've heard. And I think it is really key here to foster this innovation in a collaborative way. So we need to bring the different ones who have been here in this conversation together to really come up with the solutions we need. MDB is playing obviously a big role here, but I think it is really kind of only us together that really will manage to getting us to a solution that can address the problems you see. I think in this context, just to close, I think global solidarity and leadership have never been more important. And so we really look forward as the Alliance here to continue this collaboration, to help bridging this conversation, to make sure that we can learn the lessons, see the best practices, but also help foster more change and disruption where it's needed based on the excellent points that you've made here. So we look forward to continuing this pathway here together with you. I see lots of action items and work that needs to happen. We certainly look forward to helping being a conduit, but also working with you to making this happen. And we will get back to you with a summary from this conversation and look forward to continuing this pathway together with you. And with that, let me thank you all for having joined us. A big thanks to our panelists and for this really rich discussion, but a big thanks also for everyone joining us here in this assembly, first virtual Alliance Assembly, and for all the excellent points also on the chat, and a big thanks to my team as well. And with that, I want to thank you, and I look forward to continuing this conversation here. So thanks for joining us, and that this recording will be available, so we'll be sharing this with you as well. But thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Congratulations,
Thank you.
Barbara.
Thank you.
Thank you, Barbara.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.